Why does social justice matter to you? Tell us, like, was there a moment where it all began?
I think that's such a good question. I think probably the first moment is when I was very, very young. I come from a part of London which was considered by individuals who lived outside of it to be quite impoverished, quite neglected, quite violent. But it was my home. It kind of made me angry. I wanted to show people that it is entirely possible for you to come from places like this, but still have dreams, aspirations, still be good people, still have, all of the things that other people have. I remember seeing the front page of a tabloid newspaper where it had the face of a man who had been arrested for the killing of a police officer. I didn't know who this guy was. The way in which racial slurs were used to describe this man as an evil monster, the way in which they had accentuated certain aspects of his facial features was so deeply upsetting and angering at the same time.
Debbie Weeks-Bernard is the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice in the City of London. She's a member of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force and the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Systemic Inequalities and Social Cohesion. Debbie has made it a priority to ensure London's diverse communities have a voice in diversity. Critics of politicians would say politicians are out of touch, they don't know how ordinary people are living.
There was a moment in time, some decision makers who refused to listen to evidence.
All right, thank you so much, Debbie, for joining us at the School of Social Justice video podcast. I'm really excited about today's conversation, simply because I've seen the work you've done, both as a colleague when you were at the Joseph Ranch Foundation, where we were sat opposite each other and you were inspiring me day to day just by your leadership in the role you did there. But now also as Deputy Mayor of this great city of London, which we both dearly love and have been citizens of and members of for a very long time. And I think there's so many lessons and experiences that, I'm really curious to hear more about, to share with our students at the School of Social Justice. As you know, our mission is to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings, by learning from people who are the modern day Martin Luther Kings. And you are at the forefront of addressing a lot of the tough, sometimes really difficult social injustice matters. So first off, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this endeavour. Really exciting.
Wonderful. I mean, first off, tell us a bit about your role today as Deputy Mayor. What does it mean to be Deputy Mayor for people who might one day dream of following your footsteps?
So my full title is that I am the Deputy Mayor of London for Communities and Social Justice. So social justice is right there in the title. And what it means is that I try to help the Mayor to create a city that is more equal. London it's a wonderful city. It's a city in which people can access all sorts of opportunities, but it's a deeply unfair city. So it's a city that's got huge wealth, but also huge levels of poverty. And I have within my remit lots of really interesting, but also quite tricky areas of focus. So I have responsibility for promoting equality, but I also have responsibility for trying to bring down as much as we can some of the high rates of child poverty that we have in our city. And also for making sure that anyone who is born outside of the UK but seeks sanctuary here in our city feels welcomed, feels supported, is able to join a network, is able to access all of the opportunities that everyone should be able to access. So there's a whole range of different areas that I focus on here.
Yeah, so much. And I think it's reflective of the challenges that a city with millions of people and a very long history that London has. I mean, for you, what does actually social justice mean? We've asked a whole bunch of people from different backgrounds what social justice means. But before we get into the questions about methods for change, what are we talking about here?
So I think for me, social justice it's a little bit more than righting roles. So it's about trying to enable those individuals who do not experience a place or a thing equally to be able to do so, and recognizing that to enable people to be able to access services, goods, housing, jobs, education, all of the things that you should have within a society. That they are given the additional support that they might need to be able to do so, but also giving people agency. Because one of the most important things I feel about social justice and social justice activity is recognizing that it is entirely possible for an individual with decision-making power or a platform to speak and act on behalf of others. But also we need to give individuals the space to be able to speak and act on behalf of themselves. So it's putting people's voices at the centre of intervention, activity, activism, whatever you want to call it, as well as recognising when you have a degree of responsibility, you need to use it fairly on behalf of those individuals who don't have the opportunity to access the platform or the area of responsibility that you have.
Really important place there, just in terms of building the power, giving opportunities to people who might not have access necessarily to that. I mean, before we go into that a bit more in depth, first off, it would be great to know why you've really dedicated your life and career to these kinds of issues. Now you've reached a very strong, powerful position as a leader in London. And I say you've looked at many issues in different roles throughout your career. But where did it all start? Like, why do you do what you do? Why does social justice matter to you? Tell us, like, was there a moment where it all began?
I think that's such a good question. I think there's probably several moments. I think there are lots of people who get involved in this type of work who have had some kind of personal experience that has driven them to it. I think probably the first moment is when I was very, very young. I come from a part of London which was considered by individuals who lived outside of it to be quite impoverished, quite neglected, quite violent, but it was my home. So I think it was only until I really left the area in which I lived, when I'd go on trips with my family, or I grew up in the church, and we'd go on trips on huge buses to various parts of the country. So imagine huge minibuses filled of nothing but black people from the Caribbean.
Similar to Afro Filipinos, buses going to like random beach towns.
Right.
Frightening.
The living daylights of everyone who they see for reasons that you can't fathom because you're a member in that community. It's only when you leave it that you realise that the place that you're living in is quite noisy. It is quite neglected. There are lots of people just standing around with not much to do. And then as I got older, I realised that, I came from a place which had incredibly high rates of unemployment, very high rates of child poverty, wasn't necessarily receiving as much funding as other parts of the city was. Yeah. And so I think because I knew that the place that I was from was home, yes, it had all of these issues, but it was still a place in which I was able to thrive. It was a place in which lots of my family lived. It wasn't this horrible, terrible place that people was describing it as. And it kind of made me angry. I wanted to show people that it is entirely possible for you to come from places like this, but still have dreams, aspirations, still be good people, still have, all of the things that other people have.
That's really powerful.
Yeah.
And then a response to something which you saw right in front of you.
Yeah, as a child. But then the second moment, I think, was probably... Because the thing is that I think when you come from a particular community, you don't really you think you're the same as everyone else when you're a child, right? You just think, as a child growing up, you think you're like the other children in your school who may not look like you. Until someone reminds you that you're not. And I think it was when I got to college, and I remember seeing the front page of a tabloid newspaper where it had the face of a man who had been arrested for the killing of a police officer during uprisings in Broadwater Farm, which is in Tottenham, North London. His name was Winston Silcock. He was one of 3 individuals who were accused of killing a PC, Chief Blakelock, and that those convictions were later overturned. He was nowhere near when it happened. But at the time, I didn't know who this guy was.
Yeah.
But the way in which he appeared on the front page of this tabloid, I won't say which tabloid it was, the way in which racial slurs were used to describe this man as an evil monster, the way in which they had accentuated certain aspects of his facial features was so deeply upsetting and angering at the same time. And what I think I realised at that point was that I wanted, and I didn't know how, I didn't know what I wanted to do, I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew what I really wanted to be able to do was to subvert those sorts of descriptions, and to enable other individuals to see us as a group of individuals who are normal, you know, have jobs, go to college, do all these sorts of things. Because I think it was very clear to me at that point that I had come from a community which was seen as being more likely to be involved in crime, more likely to be, less likely to be in work, and all of those terrible things that were associated with my community then and are still in certain sectors associated with my community now. And I wanted to find a way to try to subvert those narratives. And I think I've been probably spending a lot of my life trying to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there. And I think that spark of seeing, in a way, someone who reminded you of your community, your family, people around you being, you know, just tainted based on race. I mean, for myself as a person of color as well, always it's just something you live with. And in a way, in many ways, you know, part of the reason why soon I'm moving to the Philippines to explore what it feels like to be brown in the brown world, of just, I'm curious to see what that's like, having lived in a place almost as, you know, yellow in a black and white world, where race really defines you and racism punches you in the face every day, but you just have to kind of live with it in the same way a boxer does, because that's their job. And I mean, you talk about it so eloquently in terms of how it impacted you as a kid and growing up. But now you are, you know, a black woman who's leading this institution, you know, in the mayor's office. What does that mean? I mean, you're fighting, and now you're here. You know, you're a role model to many, and you show that things and change is possible. What does that mean to you now, without kind of wanting to make it overly cheesy? I mean, it is really significant.
Yes, it is. But I think, and you probably would agree with me, Alvin, on this stuff. When you're in the midst of doing the work, you don't actually have the time to stand back and reflect on what you're doing. And so I think it's probably only when I have conversations like this that I properly have the opportunity to think about what kind of mark I could be making, and what kinds of legacy I could be leaving. Because it is now I have the opportunity to be a decision maker, because I know, and anyone who works in any area which is about trying to address injustice recognises that some of the issues which impact individuals are largely down to the way in which decisions are made. So when decisions are made poorly, or decisions are not made at all, or where there is an unwillingness to try to address an issue, I now know that I am in a position where I can help impact the way in which decisions are made and make them differently.
Yeah.
And that's both exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Tough job.
But it's good. It's good because I think that when you've spent a lifetime of working in different sectors, I've worked in the charitable sector, I've worked in the public sector, I've worked for some in the private sector, I've worked in various sectors, and have tried to use all of my working experiences in all of those places to do important work. When you get to a point like this, even though it's temporary, it's a temporary position, but I know I can use my platform, I can use my role to do some of the things that I think should have been done by other decision makers, and that is, it's great. It's great, whilst also being a little bit scary, because there's never enough time. There's just isn't enough time to do all the things that need to be done. And also, and this is massively important, no one is an island, so I can't make decisions on my own. The Mayor of London, who makes great decisions, he doesn't make those decisions on his own. Some of the best decisions that can be made in the space of social justice are the ones that you make in concert with others. Because that means that the impact is broader. It means that it could potentially be longer lasting. And also, it means that you could have an even broader impact in a much wider group of individuals. So that's really important.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, just in terms of decision making, it'd be great to go into your processes of doing that. But just before we go into kind of the methods, one final question just about representation. Some folk would say you don't need a representation of people from marginalized minority groups. Actually, anybody can represent a diverse group of people. But in democracy or politics, often when you don't see someone who's like you or from the same places, that gives you a sense that nothing is possible, that you're not being considered. A lot of the people who are funded, myself in the School of Social Justice, have been people who are ethnic minorities in London from working class backgrounds who now are in positions out to make those decisions where they see someone like themselves and say, look, this is something that we want to back. I mean, just a word on representation. What is the link between representation and social justice, and why should people care?
Well, that's a really good question. There's a very strong link between representation and social justice. And I think lived experience is important. I think for too long, many of our political classes have been very mono everything. And so that means that sometimes the decisions that are made by that group of individuals doesn't necessarily reach or properly take into consideration the hugely diverse group of individuals whom they have been elected to represent. So representation really does matter in relation to lived experience. But also, I mean, some of the things that I think that, and you know, I probably would say this, but I think that when you come from a minority community, when you have a protected characteristic, as defined by our equality legislation here in the UK, that instantly makes you a lot more empathetic to people who either share the group that you're from or who come from another minority group. And so I'm glad to see that our political classes have become a lot more representative. Working for a Muslim AM is brilliant because it gives him the opportunity not just to speak on behalf of those for whom he is a member of a community, but also it gives him an incredible degree of empathy, which I think is necessary in politics. So we need to get more of that, frankly.
For sure.
Much more.
For sure. It's a great vision of what we need more of. Let's really get into that now. So the day-to-day work, David East Bernardo here, City Hall in East London. What does your day-to-day look like in terms of how you enact social justice? I mean, can you give viewers a sense of what, you know, the day-to-day outline is in terms of your work?
Oh gosh, I don't have a typical day.
Okay, there you go. First thing, different all the time.
Oh, that is different all the time. I guess, so I can talk about today, for example. Today started with a really great meeting with an amazing group of individuals at the East European Research Centre, which is in West London. It's coming up for the 1-year anniversary for the war in Ukraine. So there are lots and lots of different activities taking place as a way of kind of marking it. But I had this great, important, intense meeting with individuals who are working in our grassroots third sector organisations who are speaking up on behalf of those who have arrived in the country from Ukraine, indeed those who have arrived from other parts of Eastern Europe, talking about the way in which some of the government policies which have been set up in the wake of the war are actually operating on the ground.
Correct.
talking to them about the ways in which some of that intervention is not necessarily working for everyone.
No.
And also listening to them and having them say to me what they think we can do more here in London, things that myself and the mayor can do more of, things that we can work together in concert with them to try to raise awareness of government, for example. So, I started my day with that. I'm talking to you today as well. And then, later on this week, I will be having a conversation about the cost of living crisis and the way in which it has continued to impact a huge array of different individuals, but also for those people who are already experiencing financial difficulty. The cost of living crisis is just exacerbating an already difficult situations. And in a city like London, one of the reasons why I'm so glad to work in a city like this, those individuals who are most likely to live in poverty or to live in financial difficulty are those from Black and brown communities. They are our minority ethnic communities. They are many of our migrant communities, the disabled people. They're all those groups of individuals who would have already been experiencing difficulty for a variety of other reasons, but just financial difficulties heaped upon them. And so, I will have meetings and conversations about raising awareness of this, but also thinking about what we can do here in London to try to mitigate the cost of living crisis, for example, or how to try to ensure that we're giving as much help to individuals who are in financial difficulty whilst recognising that we have certain levers here, that you don't have all of you, so you have to work out. So it's like, never is there a typical day.
Yeah. I mean, look, right, the critics of politicians would say politicians are out of touch, they don't know how ordinary people are living. In my experience of seeing and working for politicians, actually, politicians are often the most embedded in communities because they have to. Because they wouldn't have the job if they weren't listening. And what I got from this discussion was just one day out of the year, so much of your role is to be with people on the ground, asking questions, listening, hearing, and then representing them when you're making the case on their behalf. What would you say on methods you've employed more generally throughout your career? So right now you're in politics, you've used political means, you've been a researcher, you've been a lobbyist. Tell us about the methods of which our students could look to employ when they're trying to address some of these deep impactful problems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. There's all sorts of different methods that can be employed, I guess. But when I started out by thinking some of the most important ways to try to change a person's mind or to influence a powerful individual was to give them evidence. So I'd always kind of started from the point of, let's try to find out what this problem actually looks like. Let's look at the data and let's use that data to try to make a persuasive argument. Now, I'm old enough now to know that sometimes decision makers can respond in a variety of different ways to evidence. There was a moment in time, and I don't know if that moment in time still exists, when there are some decision makers who refuse to listen to evidence for a variety of reasons that, I don't understand, but fair enough. But I always think that you could persuade a person in a pub as much as you can persuade an individual in a government department or, who's running a big organisation, of the merits of an argument when you can show them the difference between one community versus another community simply by having the data at your disposal. Because sometimes I think the data can just speak volumes, and so I always fall back on evidence. And for those individuals who are so inclined and think that research is something that they can get into, and even if it's not something that you can get into, I would always say, always have in your back pocket a couple of stats that you could use just to try to persuade or just to explain why this is a problem that requires a particular type of response. But always then don't end with the research, because research can become a thing in and of itself.
How
So
so?
you do research and then no one sees it. No one hears about it. It doesn't get disseminated. You know about it as the person who's conducted it, but nobody else knows. So you have to also find ways of making that research translatable to everybody else, and make sure that you are spreading it as much as you can. Because then otherwise, just doing it for the sake of doing it doesn't help to make any change. It's a great piece of research. It looks good, sounds good, really persuasive, but no one gets to see it. And then that's just a waste of time. So I always think that it's important to collect, conduct, analyze, do all of that important work, then find a way of getting that out to people who will be able to use it to their advantage. So,
really important just in terms of evidence-based influencing and change making, but also a word that you used quite a lot is decision making, and of course decision makers. Do you have an example of how you've influenced a decision maker on an issue which you really have cared about and it needing to change, and also maybe a time when someone's convinced you persuasively to change your mind or to enact something and push for something, for change as a decision maker. So, do you have any examples? Any stories?
That's always going to be tricky. Okay, all right. So when I was a young researcher, I used to work for an organisation called the Writing Trust, which is a race equality organisation. Still exists, doing really great work. I did a lot of research and work around education and race. Largely because I knew that we had huge attainment gaps in the UK. There were certain groups of children who were more likely to exclude from school. I knew that there were issues with regards to how much participation there was of certain communities in like higher education, for example. So it was just my thing. A decision was made by, it was a Conservative government, that they felt that one of the best things that they could do for the national curriculum was to be less apologetic about issues like colonialism or anything where there are entire groups of individuals and communities who have been completely oppressed, because they felt that this was something that children needed to learn about. And they made this really odd decision that they were going to start removing or mandating schools to remove certain key individuals from, not so much from historical texts, because they're really historical texts, but removing them from the curriculums who weren't going to be allowed to teach about it. One of those individuals was Mary C. Cole, and the other was another Equiano. Now, because I've been working on race and education for an incredibly long time, I obviously thought that this was a terrible thing. But what happened at that point was that a whole set of activists, community organisations, got together and said, we don't like this. Started a petition, which we helped to push, and the numbers of signatories were growing and growing and growing. And then the thing that happened that doesn't generally happen to researchers, which is why I made the point about taking the research and doing something with it, happened, which was that there was an individual who knew a minister and knew a SPAD.
Special advisor.
And he came to us and said, I've got this meeting with this SPAD. I just need a couple of bullet points as to why, just a bullet points as to why removing, because they've become aware of this petition and they're sort of like saying, my God, why are people getting so exercised about it? So, just a few bullet points about why the removal of these individuals is such a problem. And so I wrote a couple of bullet points.
So and you just wrote it, and you just got a piece of paper, pen.
It literally all came out, and it literally all came out because it's something that I'd spent so long working on forever. We know, I guess, that the way in which we teach certain subjects can have an impact on a child. If you learn about the way in which the community that you're from has been featured historically, it can have an impact on you. It can make you really interested in a subject. It can give you inspiration, but also, even more importantly, and a point that I had made in this list of bullet points, all of these are issues which are about British history. They're not just, we don't think that you should include Mary Seacole just for Black children to learn about. Mary Seacole is our British history. Every single child, regardless of their ethnicity, needs to learn about. And so stuck that in, along with a couple of my back pocket stats, and this individual took it to this bad, and together with the numbers of the signatories, the minister overturned his choice, said, you know, I don't think that I should have done that, and so changed his mind that quickly.
Yeah, wow. Well, I mean, in a way, it was because, as you described, this is a great example of, you know, your expertise and all your hard work and diligent work becoming an expertise in something, and just your image of stats in the back pocket. There was a moment which happened, and you were there, armed and ready. Yeah. And I think that's a real big lesson there of being prepared, because those moments come and go. And also, I guess there's a lesson there of being connected.
Yeah.
People might call it networking, others might call it connection building, others might be calling it just having lots of friends in interesting places.
Yes.
But actually, that's a sort of great example, just in terms of all of the different factors at play there. But I can also just imagine you just just writing, and I think that it could be that simple sometimes.
Yeah, I can.
Just going with what you know, and what you have.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to share about that?
I mean, I'm still thinking about a way in which I've been lobbied.
Yeah.
My mind. But I think the thing that was so important about that also is because I knew that would have an impact on my own children being able to learn in the education system. I'm annoyed that I haven't been able to do more, because I think there are a set of decisions that have been made about the way in which different subjects have been taught in this country, which have been very problematic. Yeah. In this job, there are many communities who will say, both to me, to the mayor, to others, that communities need to learn more about these issues. So, for example, I am, at the moment, I'm co-chair of a commission. It's called the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, which was set up in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And it's gained a lot of sort of media attention, because lots of people think that we have set up this commission to run around London taking down statues. And ostensibly, the commission is about recognising that we have a city which is so diverse, like 300 languages are spoken in London, but you don't see that diversity properly represented in our public spaces. Our statues are all from the Victorian era.
I still want a statue of a nurse.
You see,
being represented. Do you know what I mean?
Look at that.
Yeah.
So we need to have a better representation of the communities that make up our city. And so as part of this commission, people will say to us what you've just said, but also that our curricula should enable children to learn about the historical contributions of everyone in this city. They need to learn about how many Filipino nurses not only died during the pandemic, because the number was sizable, but also how many are just here continuously, keeping up our NHS. And our NHS has always been a place which has featured the hard work and the toil of many, many minority ethnic and Arab communities. And so I hear frequently people who will say, our curriculum needs to reflect that. But I completely agree. No one has to persuade me of this, because I know how important it is, not just to the children from those communities, but for everyone. Everyone needs to know what you know.
Yeah.
What I know, but they don't, which is interesting.
And I think that's an example of where, everyone has some form of power, but also everyone has some form of limitation. And therefore, mayor's office, you know this, like there's limited powers to which the office has. Even the mayor of London City Carnival, Just that, but the point is working with government and other stakeholders, whether it be business or non-profit sector, to work together on these common causes. I mean, I'm thinking about maybe not needing to answer the question about how someone's influenced you, but I just really want to talk about race there because, you know, George Floyd's death in that summer, you know, it shook so much and it led to a lot of responses, and we've seen a lot of changes. How, particularly for people who are looking at watching this, I mean, racism is disgusting. It's, you know, it can kill.
Yeah.
It impacts all of us, people of colour, every day. How do you even try and address that? Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, commissions are needed, research is needed, as you pointed out, to activism's needed, protests needed. Absolutely. For people who are very distinctly asking themselves, I'm fed up with racism, what can I do about it? I mean, is there anything you can say to them?
I mean,
it's a hard question. Where do you start?
It's a hard question, Alvin. But it's a good question because structural racism is a thing. And it's really easy to become despondent about the role that you can play because it's so all-encompassing. But because I think we all know that there are different ways in which structural racism, institutional racism works against people of colour, there are different types of decisions that can just be made.
Can you give us some examples?
So if we think about, for example, the pandemic.
Yeah.
So the pandemic was definitely a global situation which impacted everyone. It had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown lives. And I think for many people who have worked in the equality space for many years, even though the extent to which those lives were taken was enormous, we were not surprised about the way in which it was impacting upon Black and brown communities, and that's largely because health inequalities are driven by structural racism, and as well as by poverty, poor housing, all of those sorts of things. And I use it as an example because one of the things that we've done here at City Hall, and one of the things that I'm glad to have been a part of, is we recognised that in order to try to just address the issues, both the long-term issues, but also the very immediate issues, we had to work across sector.
Okay.
So we could not do this work just on our own.
Yeah.
So we set up a recovery program. You and I had a whole conversation about it, I remember. And that was a board which was made up of the great and the good in London. So every key decision maker, the biggest institutions are represented on that board. And that's because each individual institution can do really incredible work on their own. So the NHS can, we can, Chambers of Commerce can, but working together we can make more of an impact. And we together have developed something which was initially called the Structural Inequalities Plan. It's called the Building Fairer Cities Plan. And I got people talking about structural inequalities, which is great.
There you go. And the debate that in itself, starting a conversation, is big.
It is. And getting people to talk about anti-racism, wonderful.
Because we also take for granted the fact that we're even talking about social justice even as a term.
Yeah.
You can't take these things for granted because it took so much for us to even be having this conversation.
Yeah,
sometimes you were like, you can't talk about this stuff, but actually that in itself is progress.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't know how you felt about it, but I know that during the pandemic, and in the wake of George Floyd, I have to be honest with you, seeing people appearing on the news and having conversations with journalists who were themselves using words like anti-racism and using the word structural inequality or structural racism. And it was just, just as part of the normal conversation. And being sat there as an individual who just thought, I can't believe that people are actually saying this to each other as part of a normal conversation. That's progress.
Yeah.
That there, it's a terrible shame that the context in which we were having that conversation is the death of an unarmed black man. But his death has led to proper conversations about what structural racism is and what it looks like and the way to tackle it. And it can be tackled. The thing that I will, and the reason that I used the pandemic and the recovery is because we recognise that we know what the drivers of those inequalities were. And if you know what a driver of something is, then you can do something to tackle that driver. So the driver was absolutely, you identify the problem. If you identify the fact that one of the drivers are, the drivers relate to poverty and lack of work, you've just poverty and lack of work.
That's it. Yeah.
And you work together to do something about that. And so decisions can be overturned. Another decision that I think is, and I'm going to use these examples because I think one of the things that's really important for people who are embarking on this kind of activity to understand is that there are ways to make a change.
Yeah.
So during that pandemic, for example, I don't know if you'll remember, but the government introduced a range of different types of initiatives in the furlough scheme. There was also, they did a very simple thing, which was giving individuals who were claiming benefits £20 a week extra. And that £20 per week extra actually reduced levels of poverty in our city and indeed across, I would imagine, the rest of wherever.
£20, I mean, that's the thing.
£20 a week.
Yeah.
And then they
Right.
took it back.
Yeah.
And that just plunged people back into poverty. But it made such a difference. We had done some analysis ourselves. We do this piece of research that we do every couple of years. It's called the Survey of Londoners. And in it, we found that levels of food insecurity for people had dropped during the period during which the government had introduced that £20 per week gift, as it were. So it shows that you can make a decision that will make a difference in people's lives. And if you know that decision is making that difference, stick to that decision. Don't remove it, because if you remove it, then you are taking people back to a place that they were before, which was not a good place. So it shows that, change can happen. And that change happened because organisations like the Joseph Franchi Foundation that we both worked for, ourselves, lots of other anti-poverty charities, lots of migrant charities were all saying to the government, this is what we think you should do, this is what you think you should do. And they finally listened. They did what was necessary, and it made a massive, massive difference in people's lives.
Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of something that Neil Jameson, the former founder of Citizens UK, the community organising UK, said, where he said, change doesn't end in Parliament or with the laws that are made. It's where it ends, and it begins on the streets in our neighbourhoods and our towns with those conversations starting and agitation.
Yes.
And now with you being a decision maker, also taking up positions of power where you can make these decisions. We're entering the final part of this conversation. I'm particularly interested to learn about the skills it takes to be a researcher, but also a politician or somebody, because we spoke about this before, you deeply care about these issues. This isn't a matter of just work. This is a, how do you call it, a calling in a way. I don't want to speak it for you, but the way I've seen your work over the years, it really is testament to that. What has it taken? Like, what have you learned as a politician in your role now that you think people who might want to follow in your footsteps should really consider developing? Like, what are skills that people need?
Wow, gosh. Okay. So this is going to be an obvious one, but actually, I'm going to say that resilience is really important.
Interesting to pick that first one.
I think resilience is important because, and that's largely because of the areas of work that I focused on, because these are big issues. They are not solved overnight. So they require coalition building, they require movement building, sometimes they require protest, sometimes they require evidence, they require all of those things. But you need to have an element of resilience to continue when those whom you are asking to make changes are not listening or are not receptive. Because it's very easy to become quite frustrated by the lack of response or the slowness of movement. And I think I've been around long enough to know that not only will things move, they may go backwards. And you have to have the ability to just kind of stick it out, which is...
Like you said,
it feels because it feels patronising. It feels patronising because it feels both patronising, but also, you know, you've got to think about your own mental health because being in this space is hard. It takes a lot out of you as an individual.
I mean, I don't think we should take this lightly. It's a theme which has come up in, if not all the conversations I had. When you spend your life in this, you also experience it. And been thinking a lot about this because at the school we of course use filmmaking conversations as a means to educate and to teach and to share lessons. And I think one of the things is a psychological aspect of change making, particularly when you're seeing so many people burn out.
Yeah.
Putting cause before self, which sometimes, you know, you have the analogy, if you're on a plane, of course, sort out your mask first before you help others. Have people, and, you know, the way you are impacts how others are as well. And I think it's not really talked about. And that's why I'm really fascinated. It's fascinating by the fact that people resilience first. I mean, what does the mental health aspect of leadership, can you share some bits there? Because I mean, I just spoke to someone and we talked about that quite in depth as well. And I know we're running out of time. I'm just curious to see, you know, given the fact that you mentioned resilience is a key thing.
Yeah, I mean,
people watching now who might be burnt.
I mean, I say resilience advisedly because I think that particularly if you're working on a set of issues which impact you as an individual. So you're working on, so for example, being working on issues to do with structural racism, being a woman of colour, does mean that every time you see a video, and I have to be honest, the way in which movements have changed, where you can actually see in real time the way in which interactions between people of colour and the police, for example, have occurred. You can see it firsthand because someone is filming it. That has a really negative impact on people. But I say it advisedly because some people feel able to get stuck in, and others don't. And I think that you have to have the space to step back and say, A, want to watch that video, nor should you. B, I don't know if I can continue doing this. I need to take some time away. And when you feel it becoming overwhelming, please do step away. I've tried to leave the kind of equality space many times and have always come back.
Why?
Because there's still so much that needs to be done. And also because I could be somewhere trying to work on something which is removed from everything, but I will see a video or I will see a set of tweets which are damaging, and I will think, no, I actually think that I need to get back in there because it's still affecting me, even though I'm here doing something which has got absolutely nothing to do with this area of work. So I go back in, but not everyone can, and not everyone should. And I think it's really important that I'm glad that you focus on that in the School of Social Justice, because it takes a real mental toll, particularly if you feel as though you're kind of knocking against a closed door.
Thank you for being open and honest there. I think it's a conversation which, you know, because in the UK we're pretty much more open to talking about mental health.
Yes.
Have started to have, but there's, I think, a lot more depth that can be had when talking about the psychological aspect of being a social justice warrior and looking at these very tough issues. Debbie, we have basically run out of time. I just want to say thank you for your contributions to the school. Before we close, do you have any final words to people who, as I say, are aspiring change makers? Do you want to leave them with any final message in their journey of trying to make a difference?
I think so. The question that you asked me about where it started, I think that for anyone that's thinking about getting involved in this, think about what it is that's motivating you and kind of check back on that every so often. Because when I was thinking about when I was coming to talk to you, I was thinking about that newspaper article that I told you that I was reading when I was like 17. I have spent, I wrote a whole PhD. It was like 92,000 words. Well, I've written chapters, I've written blogs, I've written all sorts of things. And I think I've spent a lot of my time just trying to both say, actually, it's possible for individuals like me to write, but also to try to drown out the negativity that I saw in that first article, to change that narrative. Because there's too many narratives that come from tabloid newspapers and others who should act with more responsibility. And if there are more of us writing good stuff, then we change that narrative. So always check back in, because sometimes that's the thing that keeps you going.
Yeah.
But also sometimes that's the thing that makes you realize that you've actually made an enormous difference and you hadn't realized just how much of a difference you've been making. So just always check back in, because you'll be surprised at how much good you're doing.
Powerful message to end this conversation, but also point to many things we could talk about in the future, from writing and the need for looking back at what's driving us. Thank you, Debbie, for welcoming us to your office and for sharing your thoughts with the students. Look forward to seeing you, what you do next, and we really appreciate it. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Debbie. All right, cool.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.